Hello, everyone. We're just giving everyone a minute to enter the room. Thank you for joining us. Hello, we're just giving everyone a moment to come in from the waiting room before we get started. Just be a moment. Okay, great. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. We're really looking forward to chatting about the production program with you for our second intake round this April. So yes, as I mentioned, we're here chatting today about the Real Focus BC production program. My name is Janine Steele, and I'm the project manager for the Domestic Motion Picture Fund, which this program sits under. My pronouns are she and her. And looking forward to answering any and all questions you might have today. First, we'd like to start off by, of course, acknowledging that the Creative BC offices are located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples. That includes the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. I'm grateful as ever that I'm given the opportunity to live, work, and play in these areas as well. So for informational purposes, this session will be recorded. I believe we've disabled all of your cameras, but if you wish to post in the chat and you're concerned about that, you don't want to be recorded, just you have the opportunity to change your display name. So you can turn that to whatever you'd like in that instance. Just a couple other housekeeping notes. Just a reminder that Creative BC maintains a respectful workplace environment. So do try to, I believe you all can do so, but do keep any harassment or bullying out of that chat area. As well, we do have live transcription available in English. It should be displaying, but do let us know in the chat if it's not working. You may have to turn it on for yourself in the Zoom controls. Keep your microphone on mute. I think we may have turned that off for you as well, but just in case, so that we don't get interruptions throughout. Our presentation will be broken up into sections. We will pause at the end of each section for questions related to that section, and then an opportunity again at the end to ask any questions that you might have. So lots of opportunities throughout to hear from you and hear what you'd like to hear about. If you can, when you have questions, just type them into the chat window. We'll have staff from Creative BC keeping an eye on that, and they'll scan, and we'll either answer you directly in the chat if it's something very quick, or we'll repeat the questions verbally when we get to the question and answer period. So the goal of today's session is really to go over eligibility and the process of applying in general. In the interest of time, if you have a question that's very specific to your project or your situation, we just ask that you email us after the session in order to discuss that one-on-one. Happy to do that. I'm here. I'm here for that for the next month, and any questions you might have as you put your applications together. Oops, I used the wrong control. Apologies. So just wanted to give you a brief reminder, if you're new to Creative BC, what Creative BC is. Creative BC is an independent society created and supported by the province to sustain and grow the creative industries. So really we're here today to, of course, talk about the motion picture industry, but we also provide services and funding to the interactive and digital media world, for music and sound recording, as well as magazine and publishing. We also hold our host to the Provincial Film Commission, which offers really a wide range of programs and services throughout, and we administer the tax credit programs. In terms of who's here, your Creative BC team, there's been a lot of changeover in our team, so I just like to really quickly run through this. We're here supporting all of the creative industries and the funding programs that sit within it. So if you have any questions, this is the folks to reach out to. Basically anything outside of music, if you have questions, curious about what we do, start with us. We're all here to help you. And on the call today, I'm very happy to have Robin joining me, who will be, as I say, monitoring for questions. He's available in the chat, and Matthew, Perry, and Selena are also here with us today. So what are we going to be chatting about? We'll be looking at, really quickly, as I say, an overview of the program, eligibility, the application process. We'll talk a little bit about what the evaluation process looks like and the decision making, and then what happens should you be successful in terms of commitment and contracting. And just a reminder that this is really for guidance purposes only. So refer to the program guidelines first and foremost. And as I say, give me a ring if it's still not clear to you, but hopefully it illuminates some things for you. So what is the production program? So the production program really is aimed to kickstart BC owned and controlled independent production in the province. We really, as part of our economic mandate, we really want to be a driver for production that's happening here. So we're looking to support projects through this program that are production ready and commercially viable, that are culturally relevant and engaging for Canadian and international audiences, and that highlight new or diverse voices that have historically been underrepresented. And further, we wish to act as a catalyst as much as possible for accessing national and federal funds and reduce barriers to entry. So part of our whole, service process has been, how can we make all of our programs as open and accessible as possible? So in terms of some highlights on what's available here, the maximum request that you can ask through for this program is $35,000 to $125,000, and that depends on your budget. In terms of the types of programs that we're supporting through this program, scripted feature-length projects, documentary one-offs, and documentary or factual series are welcome to apply. Our overall budget that's available for this intake is $600,000. We did have a previous round last summer that had a slightly higher budget. So a total of $1.4 million going into the province in production financing. As I say, this round is $600,000. And the deadline to apply is upcoming on April 27th, so in just about 3 weeks' time. In terms of eligibility for applicants, you can apply as whether you're a company or an individual. And so for individuals, you must be a BC resident and a Canadian citizen or permanent resident, and you must have filed taxes in BC in the last year. Keep in mind that if you're an individual that's applying, we're doing this as, again, trying to make things as open and as accessible as possible. So not requiring you to incorporate a company before you apply, but should an individual be successful in receiving a commitment, you will need to incorporate a company before we can contract. So keep that in mind. In terms of companies, they must be a company that's incorporated in BC or federally in Canada, have its head office in BC, and the primary owner and majority common voting shareholders must meet our individual eligibility. Regardless of if you're a company or an individual applying, in order to be eligible, 100% of the copyright of the project being developed must be owned and controlled by the applicant. There are exceptions for international co-productions. And again, this applies whether it's an individual or a production company. So please make sure that if you're the applicant, you own the underlying copyright. You also must be in good standing with Creative BC, and generally speaking, you will know if you are not. That just means you haven't generally been placed in default on a previous contract or had previous contracting issues with Creative BC. If you're not sure, again, don't hesitate to reach out to any of us on the team to double check that. But like I say, it's a very rare occurrence and you'd most likely know if you are. Also keep in mind, we don't require the applicant to be the producer of the project, but because we need to own the copyright. But keep in mind, if you're an applicant who's an individual writer or director, the viability and readiness to begin production is a key evaluation criteria. So if you don't have a full team attached, that's something to keep in mind, that you may not perform as strongly within the evaluation process. Oh, so sorry. In terms of project eligibility and project types, as we said, we're looking for scripted feature-length films, so a minimum of 75 minutes, documentary one-offs, that's a minimum of a broadcast half hour, and documentary or factual series, again, where the minimum broadcast is half hour per episode. So when we talk about scripted feature films, that includes all the standard genres, whether that's drama, comedy, animation, but also, we do welcome and encourage applications for more of the genre-based filmmaking. That might be horror, thriller, projects designed for children or youth, that sort of thing. In terms of what's not eligible to apply through this program, we do not accept applications for scripted television series, for shorts that are under a broadcast half hour, and for web series, as well as any productions, and this is generally standard across all of our programs, any productions that are excluded from the film and television tax credit regulations. These include things like pornography, talk shows, news, live event shows, game shows, reality television, advertising, or corporate work. So eligible projects. They must be intended for theatrical release, television broadcast, or VOD streaming in Canada within 24 months of completion. And there are exceptions for this in the ultra low budget category, which we'll talk about. For projects with a budget of $500,000 or less, you can just have a robust festival and online release strategy, although we still encourage you to pursue distribution and broadcast opportunities as much as possible. You must, again, financially and creatively owned by and controlled by the applicant. It must be considered Canadian content, so intended to be awarded a minimum of 6 out of 10 in Canadian content certification guidelines, and must be submitted before principal photography has completed. And keep in mind that pickups or retakes do not count as principal photography. So think about what your production schedule is. In terms of the funding that's available, this is dependent on budget level, and this is probably the primary change that we made from the previous intake round. We've tried to keep the 2 intake rounds as close as possible, really seeing it as one program with multiple intakes. But what we recognized, given the overwhelming interest and applications that we received, we ended up having to reduce our commitments in that previous round, and we wanted to make sure that our new budget minimums and budget request maximums were in line with what we basically were able to give out in the previous round. So for projects with a budget of $2 million or over, so what we're calling sort of our higher budget projects, you can request up to $125,000. For projects that fall in the $500,000 to just under $2 million mid-level range, you can request up to $75,000. And for projects that are $500,000 and under, this is what we're considering our ultra low budget, you can request up to a maximum of $35,000. This also tends to be in line with how Telefilm Canada has, allocated their sort of low, medium, and high budget areas. All funding will be given out in the form of a non-recoupable grant. So do keep that in mind when it comes to calculating your tax credits, because it will grind, and we can, put you in touch with our tax credit team if you have specific questions about how that works. That's something to keep in mind. You don't have to request the maximum, although it doesn't necessarily it's up to you what your budget needs and what your project needs from us. So don't feel you have to request the maximum or that you have to request less than the maximum. Request what you need. We may also, we'll try really hard not to do this given how our last round went, but we do reserve the right to reduce requested amounts in order to make sure there's a support for as a wide variety of projects as possible. And importantly, at the time of application, no other confirmed third-party financing or market triggers is required. This is, again, as part of our efforts to be as open as possible and encourage early financing where Creative BC can be one of the first funders in. We won't require any other financing. Do keep in mind, of course, that through the evaluation process, and we do expect this to be highly competitive, any confirmed financing will be taken into account when we consider what is the viability and readiness of the project to move forward. So it will, those projects that do have other confirmed financing do potentially get additional points, but it's not a requirement. I would say in our last round, it was about 60 to 70% had a fair amount of financing in place, and others were very early in their financing. So it is, of course, possible. All proposed financing will need to be confirmed before we will contract. So we will make commitments, and we'll get into this a little bit later about how that works in the commitment and contracting section. But you do need to fully confirm your financing before we will release any funds. In terms of eligible costs, a minimum of 75% of the production expenditures must be incurred in BC and paid to BC resident individuals or BC owned and controlled companies for services rendered in BC. So this is in line with the Film Incentive BC tax credit program, which is our domestic tax credit. So again, we try to make sure those are aligned as closely as possible. There are some exceptions for co-productions or documentary productions, again, in line with the FIBC guidelines. So we can talk about that in more detail if there are questions. Must be new costs that are incurred after the date of application. And a maximum of 10% of the budget can be allocated for each of producer fees and overheads. In general, when we talk about eligible costs, we try to defer to what's set out in Telefilm Canada or the Canadian Media Fund. So also keep their sort of industry standards in mind when putting your budget together. As I mentioned, there are some exceptions for documentary productions. So in this case, like our FIBC guidelines, a minimum of 75% of the production expenditures must be paid to BC resident individuals or BC owned and controlled companies, but it's not required that those expenditures be incurred in BC. We recognize that documentaries happen everywhere in the world and want to continue to support that and the ability to shoot where you need to for your subject. Similarly with co-productions, a majority owner, there is some exceptions here. So for interprovincial co-productions, very important, the majority ownership of the project must be held by the BC co-producer, so a minimum of 51% of the project. For international treaty co-productions, those minimums are generally going to be determined by the governing treaty between Canada and the country in which you're co-producing with. Usually that's a minimum of 20%, but we will defer to that and defer to Telefilm guidelines around that, who administer the international treaty co-production system. Do keep in mind that international co-ventures, including those of the United States, are not eligible for this program. In terms of targeted funding, so this is a program that is open for everybody to apply. It is an open program, an open call, but we do recognize that there have been systemic and historical barriers to access for individuals from a number of sovereignty and equity seeking groups, and we want to encourage and support their equitable access. So we have made a minimum commitment that 30% of our envelope will be committed to projects owned and controlled by either emerging filmmakers or filmmakers from any of these following groups. So that includes Indigenous peoples of Canada, Black people, people of color, individuals that are LGBTQ2S+, and people with disabilities. If you're a company that's applying, then the company must be majority owned and controlled by individuals from one of these groups. So the company must be at minimum 51% owned. And just to reiterate this is a carve out of the overall envelope. This is not does not apply to the program as a whole. So it's not a prerequisite for applying. It's just for anyone who wants to be considered as part of that targeted commitment. So anyone who meets the remainder of the program guidelines, very much encourage you to apply. Oh, shoot. Sorry, I keep switching my screen and scrolling too fast. There we go. So for the targeted funding, real creative and financial control of the project must rest with the individual or company. And keep in mind that at least 2/3 of the key creative team, so that's 65% of the writer, director, producer team, must also qualify as the primary applicant does, whether it's emerging or equity. So again, this is in line with what we're seeing that's being asked from these communities and what we're seeing with other programs across the country. In terms of emerging filmmaker, what do we mean by that? So we say that you cannot have no more than one professional credit in the role that you hold. So you can have one previous credit. You could have no previous experience and be considered emerging. But if you have 2 or more previous credits in the role that you want to hold, we will not consider you to be an emerging applicant. And what do we mean by a professional credit? So that means a credit on a completed project that is completed outside of film school or an industry training opportunity, was financed using mainstream funding sources, and subsequently either played on a broadcaster or online subscription service, was released theatrically, or was toured extensively through film festivals. Projects that are shorts, web series, or were primarily self-financed through credits, loans, or crowdfunding do not need to be counted as professional credit. So again, keep that in mind when you're calculating whether or not we would count you as emerging. So you might have 3 or 4 credits on previous work, but only one of them is really considered a professional credit, and therefore you would be considered an emerging applicant. The goal here is about identifying individuals who, for the most part, have not worked within the mainstream funding system and try to create pathways for them into that. So you'd need to meet all 3 of those elements to be considered a professional credit. And again, this is a guide to help you. It's not a requirement of applying to the program. So it might be very specific to you, and we can talk about that if you have further questions. But it's just to help you determine if you would be considered emerging. So how do we handle asking this question, or how do we handle determining this? Within the application progress, there will be a program application form. There is a targeted funding declaration. So during the application process, you'll be asked 2 questions that you need to select yes or no on. One is, I am considered emerging according to the program guidelines, and I'm considered equity according to the program guidelines. Select yes to either of these questions if you want to be considered as either emerging or equity. In terms of how we determine and validate this information right now, if you select yes to the emerging question, we'll validate this based on the biography you provide to us and the CV you give us, as well as your web presence and IMDb listings. If you select yes to the equity question, we'll primarily confirm this through the responses in our self-declaration section. So keep in mind that identification questions in the key creative allow you to select prefer not to say on that self-ID form. If you choose as an applicant, yes, I'm considered equity, but then do not select any identity groups, or your team does not select any identity groups, then you may be removed for consideration from being considered an equity applicant. And that was a behemoth of a section. So we're going to stop there. Thank you for persevering through that. Robin, do we have any questions around eligibility of either applicants or projects that need to be answered?
Yeah, we have a couple. We got one. Is it okay to share copyright through an interprovincial co-production?
Yes, absolutely. So as we mentioned, we just asked that the BC producer, the BC co-producer, owns at minimum the majority of the program, of the copyright. So that's 51%. So as long as that equitable split is there, it's fine to share that copyright. Also, we are going to be looking at the financial and creative control of that. So, if you only own 51% of the copyright, but you're bringing in 80 or 90% of the funding and doing the lion's share of the work here in BC, we may have, concerns about that financial and creative control over the project. So we will look at your co-production agreements when confirming eligibility.
By full team attached, do you mean the writer, director, and producer mentioned in the application, or the full cast and crew?
When we talk for eligibility purposes, we're just looking at key creative. So we just ask for writer, director, producer information. Executive producers as well can be included, and we just review those on a case-by-case basis, sort of in terms of what their role and relationship is to the program. The rest of your key cast and other crew, of course, very important, but we will only be looking at that we only ask for that for those who we've committed to.
Can the writer, director, and producer be the same person?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, they can. What I would say is that keep in mind the roles in which you're playing. If you're a primary applicant who's holding all 3 roles, whether you have the team around you to successfully deliver, especially in competition with other applications that may have a wider team. So think about, do you really have the capacity to deliver a project when you're the sole person managing that key creative? There may be questions about that when we get to the evaluation process from the advisory panel, and there may be generally support for folks that have at least 2 people in those 3 roles.
Can a producer apply with multiple projects?
Yes, that is one of our frequently asked questions, which I was going to bring up later, but I'm happy to answer now. You can apply for more than one project. Keep in mind, this is very limited funds, and we do expect it to be heavily oversubscribed. So while it's not restricted, we ask you to really seriously consider if the projects are both equally in a position to be production ready. Because it's highly unlikely that we would support 2 projects from the same applicant, given the limited number of applications we can commit to. I anticipate we'll be able to commit to between 5 and 8 projects. So we want to make sure that funding is shared around the province. So if you're in that position where you're like, I really have multiple projects and I think they're both quite worthy and will be competitive, then by all means put them in. Just make sure that your application speaks to your capacity and capabilities as a producing team to deliver multiple projects simultaneously.
Will you be coordinating with the current telefilm applications?
Yes, in the sense that we have spoken with Telefilm and made sure that our timelines are in line with their decision-making process. So if you are part of that crop of folks that have applied to Telefilm in the most recent rounds of funding, there is an opportunity should you find out that you've been successfully committed during the evaluation process, please feel free to reach out to me. We can update your file so that information is communicated to our advisory panel, and their decisions will come out before ours. So we've made sure that we have that information before final decisions are made.
Is it better to apply as a company or an individual?
I would say it doesn't necessarily make a difference. Again, it comes down to how the team that's around you, the proposal that you have, and as we say, we're trying to make this open as accessible and recognize, especially for emerging filmmakers or smaller smaller groups that haven't had a chance to incorporate yet. We don't want you to go through that sort of heavy financial burden before you apply to us. We did have a number of individuals that were successful in the last round, and it really wasn't necessarily a question on the table, oh, this is an individual versus this is a company, really impacting the decision. It was, of course, more about the project, its creative, the team surrounding that individual. And then, as I say, give you the opportunity to incorporate before we do contracting.
Should a director apply who qualifies as an emerging creative or a producer that has lots of credit attached?
The person who owns the copyright in the project should apply. And as I say, in order to be considered an emerging applicant, the applicant needs to qualify as emerging, but so does the majority of their team. So it's really up to, have you transferred the copyright to your producer? Or is that still residing with the writer-director? If you're applying to certain equity programs through the Canada Council or others, sometimes for those purposes, the writer-director needs to retain the copyright, and therefore they should be the applicant. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter which one's coming through. It will come down to the overall team in terms of determining emerging eligibility.
Great, I think that's it for this section.
Excellent. Okay, great. We will move on to our next section, which is the application process. So what is the pathway to an application, a successful application? We very much ask you to please review the full guidelines. There's also an FAQ on our website. The evaluation criteria is there. There's an evaluation matrix. We've provided an application checklist, and you can look at the full submission form before you start entering anything. So please look at all of those things together and then start to gather your materials you need to submit. You'll then, once you have all those materials together, you can submit online. It does allow you to save drafts, so you can always come back to it. And then ultimately, once you've submitted, we also ask you to inform your key creative about our self-identification form. And this is something that's new to the process. In the past, we've asked the lead applicant to provide self-identification information on their key creative team members. And we're implementing a test process for collecting that self-identification forms directly from the individual people. So during the application process, you'll be asked as the lead applicant to provide their name, their role, and their email address. Once you hit submit, our system will automatically send them a separate email, including yourself, if you're one of those key creatives, asking them to fill it out. And then the system will attach it to the application form. So we encourage you to give your key personnel a heads up that this form is coming and that it needs to be filled out. Because it comes from our online system, it often gets caught in spam filters, so they may have to go and search for it and they might not notice right away. Keep in mind that with the self-ID form, submissions of the forms are mandatory for all CoPreative, but through that process, every individual can select prefer not to say for all questions. That's entirely up to them whether or not they want to share that information with us. And that's only really, it's used if you're applying as an equity filmmaker, that information is necessary in order to validate that request. But otherwise, it's only used for overall statistics to give us a better understanding of both who's applying to our programs and where our funding is going. It's not shared in any other way. So what does that application, that online submission form look like? If you've applied to us before, this will look very familiar. If not, happy to answer any questions as you work through it. It's powered by a system called FormStack. Asterisk, as you're going through it, you'll see a lot of fields have an asterisk next to them. Those are our required fields. As I mentioned, you can save it at any time and return to the form to make corrections. When you save it, it should send you a link. If you don't get that link, please reach out to us and we can try and get it out for you. The form will notify you when you hit submit, if there's a required field that's been left blank and you'll need to go back and complete it. So again, encourage you to look through the application checklist to gather everything that you need. The application checklist will let you know what's required materials, what are dependent materials, and what are optional materials. And give you an opportunity, as I say, to prepare those in advance so you're not overwhelmed when you first open this application form. So just a quick recap, what are our required materials? There's the online application form, which will include information about the applicant, information about your project, such as the genre, its length, the project type, the log line, the description. You'll be asked to submit your budget and a financing plan. There will be information on yourself and your key personnel. We'll ask for a project creative package, an audience, marketing, and distribution plan, and a production schedule. In terms of dependent materials, there are some materials that are dependent on the type of application you're submitting. So a personal statement is required only if you're an emerging applicant. And this is something that we found very useful for those who don't necessarily have a track record in the province, so that we can get to know us and our advisory panel can get to know and understand you and where you're coming from. It's your opportunity to tell us your story and why now is the time to be supporting your growth and trajectory. It's been really useful. Definitely encourage it. Other dependent materials will include a select scene from your script. This is for scripted projects only. This is something that's new this round. Again, feedback from the last round, heavily oversubscribed. So we're not requiring a copy of the full script this time around, since our advisory panel members did not have an opportunity to read them from beginning to end. So we're asking you instead to give us a select scene, which really highlights and shows off the writing and the scene setting to its full potential. You can still attach a copy of the full script, but I can't guarantee it will be read. Also keep in mind that there is a fulsome story arc, including plot points and its resolution, included in your creative package, so we can understand what your story is. The creative package is not about sort of marketing blurbs. It is very much about, this is the story I'm telling, these are the characters I want to share, and what you're trying to accomplish with that story. And that will aid us without the opportunity to read the full script. Other dependent materials include a community engagement plan, and I will get into that a little bit later, but this is for projects that intend to shoot in or collaborate with underrepresented or vulnerable communities, something that is increasingly being requested with grant programs, and we found very useful to make sure people are thinking about the impacts their filming has on the communities in which they wish to represent. You can also include a letter of support from a community rep. Again, if applicable for projects that intend to shoot with underrepresented groups. Further optional materials for any program is the link to a demo reel, a teaser, or previous work. We ask for 2 maximum. So while not required at this point, this is a visual medium we're working in. So video links have been quite popular with our advisory panel members to better understand the artistry behind you as the applicant and your creative team. We just ask that you avoid teasers or reels that are made up of inspirational footage because it doesn't allow the advisory panel to really figure out what your creative potential is. If you do that, if that's something that you feel is important to the creative process, please we ask that you clearly mark it as inspirational footage versus footage that's been shot by the filmmaker. You also have the opportunity to include a letter of support specifically for you or your project. And this is different than the underrepresented community support. This is we're asking, again, an opportunity to show us who's in your corner, who's rooting for your success or the success of your project. Let someone speak for you in a reference. Again, helps the advisory panelists get a better sense of who you are and who the community is that's behind you. So can be useful, not required. In terms of the application process around budget and financing, you can use any existing budget template that you would like, including CMF or telephone budget forms, or if you use a budgeting software. There are links to the CMF and telephone forms on our website. At the time of application, we only require the top sheet. And just a reminder, the budget should be submitted for the total anticipated production costs, not just your ask of us. So we want to see overall what is it going to cost for you to deliver this project that you're describing to us, and have you budgeted accurately for that? So that is a question that's come up within our advisory panel members. They have been very good at looking at the top sheets, so keep that in mind when preparing it. Also remember that your budget and your financing plan should meet. So if you have a budget of $500,000, make sure that the financing sources in your application total $500,000. Saves me a lot of time when I have to follow up and ask questions about that. If you don't have Excel, you can use Google Sheets and convert it, or you can export it as an Excel document or a PDF to upload to us. There are lots of resources online if you're new to budgeting. Highly recommend the one-stop business workshops that are held offered by the CDC. And for documentary filmmakers, Hot Docs has a really great online PowerPoint presentation, extremely detailed line item by line item for budgeting for emerging filmmakers. So some common questions about the application process. We talked about this one. What is a community engagement plan? So as I said, we'll talk about that a little bit more. So this is an opportunity it's a newer process, like I say, that's coming out of a lot of thought that's gone into working with underrepresented and vulnerable communities. And initially was originated within the Indigenous filmmaking community. So it was really about best practices for working with Indigenous subject matter with Indigenous communities. And it's really encapsulated in a document called On-Screen Protocols and Pathways, which is maintained by the Indigenous Screen Office. What this does is it really embraces the philosophy of if it's about us, it should be by us. So while it primarily applies to individuals, if you have a project that's dealing with Indigenous themes, Indigenous stories, or shooting within Indigenous communities, it's pretty much a requirement. But we also want to hear from you if you're working with other underrepresented or vulnerable communities. And the Black Screen Office, for example, has been developing a protocol document called Being Seen, which offers respectful practices in collaborating with other underrepresented groups. So both those two resources are there for you, depending on what your subject and what your project deals with. So it's an opportunity to talk about the process you intend to undertake, and should demonstrate that you've thought through how you can be collaborative and respectful. Each plan is going to be highly dependent on the needs of the project. So that could look like involving community members in your creative team. It could look like hiring advisors. It could look like having counselors on set. It could look like hiring local crew, or entering into written agreements with the communities. If you're not sure if your project needs an engagement plan, then don't hesitate to follow up with us and we can talk about what. Generally speaking, I don't want folks to feel like they have to submit it, but it has, as I say, has been useful if you're dealing with it within these communities or with any vulnerable subject matters. It's been very useful for the advisory panel members. All right, and we'll stop there again. Are there any questions about the application process, Robin?
Yeah, for the product synopsis that the application form is asking, is that a long synopsis or should that be submitted on a separate document?
Good question. So there's a couple, we'll ask for a log line and then we ask for a longer synopsis. I can't remember off the top of my head the character count on that. It's fairly good. But then the third piece of material that we ask for is a creative plan. So what I would suggest is folks think about that in sort of, there's a log line, there's an overview synopsis that goes into our online system. It's used a lot as sort of quick reference for advisory panel members. But then the longer sort of detailed, act by act story plotting and resolution information can go into the creative plan. So sort of think about it as short, medium, and long. You've got 3 opportunities to tell that, and do encourage folks to maximize the use of those 3 different spaces to tell us about your project. Don't necessarily just copy and paste one after the other.
Can we submit more than one selected scene if they fit within 5-page limit?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, of course you can. I think we're trying to sort of keep a reasonable limit in terms of the time that the advisory panel members put into reading additional materials, but as long as it's in that sort of page count, that's fine.
Can you apply for the same project that got rejected last time with Creative BC?
Yes, great question. Absolutely. We do encourage that. It was highly oversubscribed, as I talked with many of you about, highly oversubscribed the last time. And so if you were not successful, we do welcome and encourage you to apply again. And if you want to talk about your application, then don't hesitate to reach out to me.
As for the financing plan or structure, would cast include donations of salary and producer investment complete that?
Yes, if you have in-kind or deferrals included in your financing plan, we encourage you to reference that in the budget, and then with a corresponding in-kind or deferral line item in your financing plan.
How are we able to properly assess a project without reading the full script?
It's a very good question. I mean, I think that we are just trying to balance time and energy. And so this is something that we're trying. The reality is that the full script was prohibitive for us to review. We had nearly 100 scripted applications the last round, and we would have been evaluating for months. We do not have the capacity to read that many. So that's why I encourage you, you're very creative individuals. What are the other ways besides reading a full script can you convey the creative of your project? So think about the log line, the synopsis, and that creative package. Use all of the pages in that creative package to walk us through your story arc, to introduce us to your characters, show us why your project is unique. So really utilize those spaces. As I say, if you wish to attach the full script, you can also do that. But as I say, we're trying something because it was too prohibitive for our advisory panel the last round.
Can you be more specific with the full story arc and full act structure? Is there a format you prefer?
I don't have a format because, as I say, we're trying this out. So I think in terms of what I reading in the past, I think something that you can break it into Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. You can do that through, a couple pages of paragraphs, just something that really shows the beginning, the middle, and an end of your story. And as I say, don't underestimate the use of character profiles to explain to us who your characters are and perhaps what their individual arcs are as well. Who is your leading characters versus supporting characters? Break that down for us. Will help us get a really full picture of the story you're telling and the types of characters you're portraying.
This is a pilot program, the second of 2 intakes. Will the program be renewed? When will the next intake be?
It is a pilot program because the Domestic Motion Picture Fund was a one-time commitment from government. So I'm very hopeful that given the success and the interest in this funding, that we will be able to get the program renewed, but it is dependent on the provincial government renewing funding. So please get on the phone with your industry stakeholders, with the CMPA and other folks who are actively lobbying government, lobby them directly through your own MLAs and explain to them why this is so crucial. We'll be doing that as best we can on our end as well and showing the outcomes and performance indicators of the program, but also need your help to amplify that voice so that they can't take it away from us again, or rather that they renew us. That would be really great. So it will be dependent on that. We're hopeful that in 2023 we can offer it again.
I think that should be it for this section, Janine.
Awesome. Thanks, Robin. Okay, on to our next section. So about the evaluation and decision-making process. So once you've gotten your application in, what happens? We will do an initial application, a review of all applications to confirm that they are complete and eligible. Incomplete applications, and will be given an opportunity if there are documents missing. You'll be informed and given a short period, generally within 5 days, to submit anything outstanding. Following this sort of short eligibility period, incomplete or ineligible applications will be withdrawn. And if you are an effective applicant, you will be notified at this stage that it's not moving forward. Once that eligibility review is complete, then we'll move on to a creative evaluation. And from there, decisions will be communicated. We anticipate that we will need a minimum of 12 weeks to complete the review process. We anticipate again that there'll be a lot of interest in the program. So we are aiming to share decisions in sort of mid-July, mid to late July. What is involved in that creative evaluation? So as I mentioned, we have this assessment criteria as an evaluation matrix on our website. Please take the time to look at that and think about how your application speaks to these different points. So this program is selective and competitive, and it takes into account several factors that include the background, the track record and capacity of the applicant and their key creative team. Looks at the strength, the feasibility, originality, and creative quality as demonstrated through the project plan. And also looks at the viability of the project and its appeal and impact within audiences and within the marketplace. So whether that's in theatrical space or the television broadcast streamer space. As mentioned, the criteria for our emerging applicants, as well as ultra low budget projects, will be slightly different, trying to reflect their different needs and pathways to success. So for example, for emerging applicants, we will ask our advisory panel members to think, instead of thinking about their experience and track record, think about their background and the articulation of their career path through their personal statement. We'll take that into consideration. As well, there's an opportunity here for additional points to be awarded for representation of sovereignty-seeking or equity-seeking groups amongst the key creative team members. This is beyond the applicant and targeted funding. And we also look at additional points awarded for other equity factors such as gender parity, language, and regional representation. So how do those decisions get made? We will have creative evaluations conducted by both BC staff, our creative BC staff, and industry professionals brought in on a series of advisory panels. There will be 2 advisory panels to focus on those areas of expertise, one for scripted content and one for documentary or factual content. We may add more depending on the volume of submissions and or employ a shortlist process in order to support that. Advisory panel members will be industry professionals that represent a cross-section of key demographics in the province and in our industry. For the most part, decisions that are recommended by the advisory panel members should reflect those recommendations. We do keep Creative BC staff will have the opportunity to ensure there's an intersectional balance of those decisions and that again reflect the makeup of our province and our program goals, and may adjust recommendations before finalizing. Once those advisory panel members have met and recommendations have been submitted and confirmed by Creative BC, all applicants will be notified by email of those decisions. Unsuccessful applicants at that point have the option of requesting feedback on their application, should that be useful, whether coming back to Creative BC in the future or applying to other programs. Once the evaluation process is complete, what does it look like to be committed and contracted? So before contracting, Creative BC will go through a business affairs review. We'll look at your chain, we'll ask for extensive chain of title documentation at this point. We're not asking for it up front. We're just asking for a declaration that you do in fact own or control the chain of title, and we'll validate that during this phase. We'll also ask for copies of all of your confirmed financing agreements or any updates to your financing or budget, a copy of your full production budget, which we'll review in more detail, and any updates or changes to your production schedule. Again, at this time, any successful applicants who applied as an individual will need to incorporate an eligible BC company before contracting. Successful recipients will not move forward to contract until all their project paperwork is confirmed and their financing is locked. Applicants that cannot provide sufficient materials may not be able to move forward to contracting, and their commitments may expire. So what's this about closing financing? So committed projects have an initial 6 months from the date of commitment to close their financing. And ideally, that's the time period in which it can be done. We, of course, know and understand with funding cycles the way that they are, sometimes that can take a bit longer. So if you are in the earlier stages of your financing and you do receive a commitment, for projects that can then demonstrate at least one additional third-party financier comes on board in that 6 months, we will provide you an extension of a further 12 months to close financing. So again, this is trying to balance the needs of making sure this money is getting out into the province and contributing to production, while giving folks time in a reasonable amount of time, while giving folks some flexibility to be at earlier stages of the financing of their project. It is a bit of a test, and we'll continue to evaluate that should we be able to offer the program again moving forward. So any funds from expired commitments at that point will be rolled into future programming through the Domestic Motion Picture Fund of Creative BC. And that's the quick and dirty of commitments and contracting. Any questions?
Will Creative BC use a different industry panel for this assessment, considering that many applicants are resubmitting proposals that were in the first intake?
Yes, it's likely that our advisory panel would not be the same panel. So that's something to keep in mind. If it is always going to be to the individual perspective of those advisory panel members, and we try to make sure we rotate out those advisory panel members from application to or intake to intake. So it could be a different group. It's also dependent on availability, and those who were previously advisory panel members may be choosing to apply, or folks that, or vice versa. So we put together the advisory panel that best meets the needs of the program once we've seen who's applied.
Will the names of these panelists be released after the program for transparency?
I believe that they are included. This is my first year still at Creative BC. I believe that they are included in our impact reports. So annually, that information is available for viewing.
As I am applying for a ultra low budget feature as a writer, director, producer with a couple of indie features under my belt, what additional key creatives or key personnel would strengthen my application?
I mean, I think that's going to be dependent on a number of factors. It's not to say you have to attach other key creative, but it could be a good opportunity in your creative package and your distribution plan to talk about the key cast that if you already have cast attached, that would be useful to know. If you have executive producers or consultants, that sort of wider team behind you, that would be useful to know. You can choose in your creative package to talk about who your director is, or who your your editor is, or who your director of photography is. And again, not required, but is something you can choose at your discretion to include in your creative package. So you can talk about, despite the fact that you're in those sort of primary roles, these are the people behind me. And again, think about how you can convey why you have the capacity to fill all those roles. When you think about the writing you have in your various documents, whether that's talking about the other indie works that you've done and how they have performed if you've been in similar positions, that sort of thing.
I think we are good, Janine.
So I think that is it then, unless there are any other questions. Anything else before we wrap up for the day?
Can a TV series package itself as a feature film to apply for this grant and then distribute it later as a series?
One of our previous recipients was packaged as both a series and a feature film. What I would highly caution that was successful in large part because that was built into the development and the production of the program. That was the plan all along. And that's why it's successful. I wouldn't package something just to make it eligible. Television series are a very unique beast. Based on our industry consultations before we wrote these programs, the funding that we have available at this level is not enough to make a dent in television financing at the production phase level. So instead, we focused on trying to support television series at the earliest stages in development and in other ways and through other partnerships. So I wouldn't try and retrofit it in, especially if you don't already have a distributor on board who's going to be distributing that feature film. If that's something that's built into the DNA of your project, then by all means, give me a ring and we can chat about it. Anything else?
Is this production funding intended for big budget projects that already have a lot of confirmed financing?
Not necessarily, no. I would say that the average of the budgets from our previous round of commitments is really, they were in the, the max was really on the, the $1 to $2 budget, $1 to $2 million in budget, and then the lowest was a couple $100,000 and the highest was sort of 15 or 20 million. So it has quite a variety, but the majority were in that $1 to sort of $3 million range. And so it's not intended just for that. I think that when we think, again, it comes down a little bit to the creative of the project. It comes down to the viability to deliver. And there is a balance, when we're talking about an amount of $100 to $150 to $125,000, what impacts that can have on a budget that's significantly higher than that versus budgets that are slightly smaller. It's going to ultimately, they're all going to kind of play in, and it's not necessarily going to be a one or the other thing. We're trying to support a variety of work at different budget levels and at different impacts. So it's not a one or the other, but I think we kind of saw most of the projects in that sort of middle range.
Can a mix of equity and emerging be used for targeting, or must it be one or the other?
Absolutely. If you qualify as both equity and emerging, I encourage you to select both. We do take both of them into consideration.
When will Creative BC know whether the DMPF will be reinstated for the next fiscal?
I don't know. Unfortunately, I don't have a timeline for that. This is the last of our 3 programs that we've designed and released under the DMPF. So once these decisions are done, my primary job will be to talk with government and hopefully encourage them to renew it. Generally speaking, for a fiscal year, the budget is announced in March. So hopefully we'd know then, but I can't guarantee that the decision will, that it will be on that timeline. It's sort of outside of my control.
I think that's all the questions for today, Janine.
All right, perfect timing, everyone. We're 2 minutes to the hour. Thank you for taking time out of your day to join us. It's been lovely. And as I say, I'm here, Robin's here, our team is here. Don't hesitate to reach out if you have any other questions or as you put together your application. Have a great day, everyone.